You go.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So again, welcome everybody. Everyone who's coming back for the second day. This is the second day of the 2019 Fitzpatrick Macular Foundry Plan Reunion. This is the Northeast USA Regional Gathering Sunday Lecture Series. My name is Ryan Fitzpatrick, as all of you guys know from yesterday. But before we start, I just want to give a quick round of applause to my tech team, Kevin and Chris over there. And then also a round of applause for Ryan in the back for being the guy in the front. Thank you so much, Ryan. And Ronan, if you can hear me now, I very much appreciate the words that you spoke to us through Dan yesterday. And we want to give a warm welcome to you as you watch this program and anyone else who's watching the broadcast. Thank you so much for tuning in and supporting us. Round of applause for that. Say it louder? Okay. All right. Chris wants me to speak up, so for the people in the front, I'm not yelling at you. I just want to make sure that my voice carries to the microphone over there. So I'm going to have to try to project. All right. By a show of hands, how many of you guys have submitted a sample to the Fitzpatrick DNA Study? Just as a quick show of hands. Okay, good. How many people have clues to what's going on with the DNA study, or if you're bewildered by it? If you have a clue, put your hand up. Okay, 2 hands. If you're totally bewildered, put your hands up. All right, a bunch of hands. Okay. It is difficult to understand DNA, and there aren't that many resources that are out there to help you quickly digest what they're thrown at you. And in addition to the fact that genetics are complicated, as we were discussing last night at dinner, I mean, it's just inherently complicated. There's also different theories that are flying around about our DNA study, and of course, how do you mesh the results of the DNA study with what you know from your paper trail or your oral history, your family history? So there's lots of different ways in which people are trying to make sense of it, reconcile things, and it is a very, very valuable asset. Now, before I begin, I need to also have you guys understand something. We started this project, or I shouldn't say we, I wasn't involved in 2000 with the start of this project, but Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick in California was the individual who initiated the DNA project, the Fitzpatrick DNA Study, in the year 2000. Ronan had his first gathering in 2000. I think about 100 people attended that one. And it was a great success. And on the way back, Colleen is reading an in-flight magazine about DNA. And of course, she's also a forensic genealogist. And she says, of course, why don't we have a Fitzpatrick DNA Study? That would be a great way to unite all of us. We can find out how we're interrelated. So she began the process of starting that DNA study in 2000 with a company called Relative Genetics. And again, the goal was to unite us, to find out how are we related. Even if our paper trails can't get back beyond maybe perhaps immigration or maybe beyond 1800 or wherever you stop at your brick wall ancestor, perhaps DNA would offer the solution to have people show how they're interrelated. And so she started this project. The company that we started with was Relative Genetics, and it was in the early 2000s. The project is continuing today. It's bounced around from several companies. It went from Relative Genetics to Family Heritage to then Family Tree DNA. And Dr. Colleen shepherded us to Family Tree DNA. In time, there were other administrators of the project that superseded her. She's now the emeritus for our project as far as we're concerned, but Seamus Brennan was for a long time working on the project. And he had been working as a co-admin under Colleen. And then he left the project, and now it's being administered by Mike Fitzpatrick in New Zealand. And what has happened last summer, before our gathering for this society occurred last summer, Dr. Mike broke away from the society, and he started his own rival group. So there's now 2 Fitzpatrick societies. So that also adds to the confusion. When people go online and they're looking for information, you might see Dr. Mike's group. Dr. Mike's group is actually a different society than ours. And so he set up his own rival structure and kind of fragmented the group, and we found it very damaging. But he is also now the administrator of the DNA study. And so this was we were very frustrated because we felt that we had kind of lost the DNA study, which had been going on since 2000, to someone who is now considered, in some ways, I hate to say this, but a rival. Okay? He's not really a rival, but he does have a separate society, and they have a different way of doing things over there. It's a smaller society. The mass numbers are on our side, and I think that we have a much stronger connection to Ireland and around the world. And I'm not trying to diss Mike's society. People can join Mike's society. They can go wherever they want. Everyone's an adult. people should go where they get answers, but I feel that there are now new theories coming out of that society that I don't find very sound. I don't find them to be historically sound. And of course, this is coming from the administrator of the DNA project, so this is a formidable thing. We can't just say, oh, well, he has different theories. I mean, this is DNA evidence, and what it deals with is the identity of human beings. Okay, so we all have our family story. We all have to know who we are. And I was prompted by what I was seeing on the DNA website at FTDNA for the Fitzpatrick study to put together my own PowerPoint to give a different perspective. Okay, part of the reasons why is that when Mike talks about the DNA study and the data that's coming through, there's excellent data on every Fitzpatrick that is during the study. When he writes about it, he writes it in very absolute terms. But I don't believe that it's a very absolute thing. I think there's lots of room to debate. If you were to read what Mike writes, he speaks about it as if it's settled science and there's no room for any kind of theorizing, but I think that's not the case. When I was gathering people for this group together, I was emailing people who were in the DNA study saying, hey, if you're available this weekend, come to Albany. We're going to have a gathering. I'd like to meet you. I know David Dooley is one of the guys, he's not here today, but he was here yesterday. He's one of the people that responded to those requests. But I got one response from a man named John Fitzpatrick who said, what's the point of going to a gathering? Didn't you hear? I'm not even Irish anymore. And I said, oh my goodness. And the reason why he said that is because in the group of Fitzpatricks, okay, as I said yesterday, we're polygenetic. We have different origins for a lot of different Fitzpatricks. The Ossorian Fitzpatricks, who are the most historically prominent, and that's when you read history books, that's what you're going to encounter first, most likely. Dr. Mike from New Zealand is now using the DNA study, and he's saying, Ossorian Fitzpatricks don't even have an Irish origin. They're not even from Ireland. Their blood is not Irish. Other Fitzpatricks are really Irish, but he says that the Ossorian Fitzpatricks are Normans. And there's even some further developments very recently. He's saying specifically now, you're not even just Normans, but you're Fitzgeralds. So this is a very interesting development because the Fitzpatricks of Ossory have spent centuries fighting against the Normans. They lost their land to the Normans. And so to say now that they're not even Irish is very damaging. And I could see that in the letter to John Fitzpatrick. I said, would you come to the gathering? This is an older man. He's in the twilight years of his life. And I could feel in his words how much wind had gone out of his life. He just said, what's the point? I'm not even Irish anymore. And I felt I could feel the sting in his words. He's upset. And he does not know how to make sense of the DNA study. He does not know enough about Irish history to counter any of these claims. He does not know enough about DNA to counter any of these claims. You have the administrator of the DNA project telling him he's not Irish. What's he going to do, right? So it was a wound I could see in him. And so I said, all right, that's it. I got to put together a PowerPoint because I do not agree with this interpretation of the data. So this is why I have this PowerPoint, Ossorian Origins, New Theories and Old Facts. Now, one of the reasons why Mike broke away is because he felt that our group was too focused on the Ossory group, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. It was our group that discovered that we're not all from the Ossory region, we're all from different regions, okay? So we're not trying to focus on just one. We do want to focus on the Ossory group because we want to find out the history that's there, but we want to focus on every other group equally. So we want to focus on everybody. We do not want to just focus on the Ossory group. The irony, though, is by breaking away and coming up with this new theory, I think Dr. Mike is focusing a lot too much himself on the Ossory group. So the new theories versus the old facts doesn't even just concern the Ossory group because the theory is, as I get to it, that the Ossory people and the Cavan people have a mix-up, and I'll show you. All right, so let's start. And I'm going to have a little trouble with the clicker here. All right, so are the Fitzpatricks Irish? This is the question. All right, this is a very important question because our name is Fitzpatrick, and we're constantly having to endure the assault. Oh, you have a Fitz name, you must be Norman. I've heard this many times just because we have the name Fitz. But if you know the Fitzpatrick history, the name originally was Macula Patrick, the son of the devotee of St. Patrick. And it has a long history in Ireland before the name got changed by an agreement in 1541 with Henry VIII, where it was changed to Fitzpatrick. But the people were Irish. Okay, so they just adopted the Norman name. It's the only extant name right now that is a Fitz name, but is actually not of Norman origin. Okay, all the other Fitz names out there, like Fitzgerald, Fitzwalter, Fitzmaurice, Fitzstewart, Fitzpayne, every other Fitz name, Fitzclarence, they are all Norman, or they're later English, okay? And it's not the case that every Fitz name, sometimes you hear this too, sometimes, I'm gonna say a bad word, but sometimes you hear Fitz means bastard, or illegitimate child, right? And that is the case for certain families living in the 16 and 1700s in England, where Fitzroy, right, they were known illegitimate descendants of several kings, or Fitzgeralds, okay? But that's not every Fitz name. There's more often than not, most Fitz names are of earlier Norman heritage, and they exist both in England and in Ireland, but they don't actually, the name Fitz itself is a prefix. It does not imply illegitimacy, okay? But really, are the Ossorian Fitzpatricks Irish? Is there anyone here in the audience, some of you I know, but put your hands up if you're from the Ossorian group, if you know that you're from the Ossorian group. Put your hands, if your results have come back, okay. Put your hands down. The second biggest Fitzpatrick population in Ireland are the Cavan group. Anyone here from County Cavan?
How do we know that?
You would be able to know from your DNA results. I think you might be from the Cavan group. I'm not sure. But we checked it last night.
Yeah,
I'm forgetting now already what it is. But I think you're...
Does it tell me on the page?
It will. Yeah, it will.
Well, I've got it up here, but...
Yeah, they color-coded it. The great thing is if you go to DNA results...
Purple.
You're purple. I think the Cavan group on this, correct me if I'm wrong, somebody, but it might be, you'll say Cavan, you'll see Cavan. More of an orangey color to like maybe an olive green. But it doesn't matter if you're right now, because it affects both of our, this new theory that Mike is putting forth affects both of our groups, okay? So are we descended from the kings of Ossory from pre-Norman times? Because that's the claim that the Ossorian Fitzpatricks can make, that we're descended from the kings of Ossory from before the Normans, who have an illustrious heritage going way back in Irish history. Or are we not? Are we actually descendants of the invaders? You know? So let's say. So the historical narrative, and I think there's a laser pointer on this, right? Is there no laser pointer? There might not be a laser pointer. Ryan, you're available? That's right. I'll just point right here. So this is the Ossorian region in pink. Okay.
No.
The original homeland of the Maculopatricks within Ossory was around present-day Kilkenny City. They were based in central Ossory, which is right by the letter I here in Ossory, Osrica in Gaelic. Okay. They were there for a long time. Eventually the name was taken in 1066, Maculopatrick. But when the Normans invade, that is one of the key areas in which they make inroads. Okay? They take territory, and eventually the Maculopatrick chiefs submit to the Normans. When the Normans arrived, it's also worth mentioning that Ossory was not a single political unit. It was fragmented. It was politically divided into three groups. Two sections of the Maculopatrick clan had divided Ossory amongst each other, Central Ossory and South Ossory. And another clan, the O'Keely clan, had taken that division, taken the opportunity, they saw weakness, and they broke away, and they tried to also rule a little chunk of Ossory themselves. Okay, so at the arrival of the Normans, Ossory is not even a unified polity, and that's one of the reasons why they weren't able to make as good of a defense of their territory. Although they did make a good defense, it's recorded even by the Normans how well the Ossorian peoples, the Maculopatricks and all of the followers, all the tribes from that area, coalesced as best they could to try to halt the Norman invasion. Of course, the Normans brought in new weapons and new tactics, and they weren't able to fully stop them. But they wound up, in the early days of the Norman advance, keeping control of their main portion of land. They submitted to Strongbow, and then eventually they were evicted under William Marshall. William Marshall is known as the greatest knight in English history. Perhaps he's eulogized actually as the greatest knight that ever lived. That might be a bit much, but he was a very successful and very good knight in terms of being able to wield power. But he was the one that is responsible for the original building of Kilkenny Castle, and he's the reason why the Maculopatricks of Central Ossory fled up to Upper Ossory. They realized they just did not have the numbers, the strength, the weapons, the money to hold on to their ancient homeland. So what they did is they went north to where the Sleeve Blue Mountains are, right up here in this upper section. And there had been some Normans already been put up there by Strongbow, but the Maculopatricks realized this is our last chance, we've got to make a stand there. It's more mountainous terrain. They sunk their teeth in, and they fought like mad to evict anyone out of that territory that wasn't going to get under them. And it caused a land war in Upper Ossory for a long time, but eventually They did it. They held on to the last remaining chunk of their territory, and they kept up a war with the Normans for a very long time. Okay, until eventually in 1541, when we're all aware now that Brian submitted to Henry VIII and took the name Fitzpatrick. Okay? And that represented a change in the way policies were done. And that wasn't done willy-nilly. I mean, I could talk probably for another hour as to why he did that. It was very dangerous in Ireland to be a landowning chief of medium size, because the English were able to send out predatory excursions that had license to kill and murder with no repercussions and no end date. So a band of soldiers would get together and they could do whatever they wanted to the Irish for however long they wanted. There was no restraining them. And Brian had a couple of sons who were very famous in fighting against the English, and they were calling bad attention to Upper Ossory. And so to preserve the people that lived there, to preserve Irish culture, to preserve their own territory, he eventually submitted. In addition to that, it was also that the crown was looking to empower somebody against the Ormond butlers. This very fertile land down here, which is better than this land, this fertile river valley, had eventually become inherited by the butlers of Ormond, okay? Or as John Hylas Smith would call them, the Fitzwalters. They had inherited from William Marshall much of that land, and there was enmity between the Norman Ormonds and the Maculopatricks. Different culture, different language, different understanding. The County Laois border with County Kilkenny, the very fact that there is a border there, and it's not one continuous county the way it is on the map here, is because the Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory had a long-running war with or feud, but it's a little bit more than a feud, with the butlers of Ormond. So the very fact that there is a County Laois, County Kilkenny border is because it's two different peoples, two different cultures clashing for a long time. Okay, so a little timeline here. I'm going to try not to overwhelm you guys with history. This timeline could be fleshed out a lot more, but for the sake of the genetics, there are a couple of key things that we got to think about when looking at this timeline. So I've stripped it down just to a few events, 8 events, because if you have a surname like Costigan or MacShira, there's certain points in time where your branch breaks away, or there's certain events in Ossory that you got to know about that don't make any sense if Mike's theory is true, or rather the reverse. These things happen, and this is why Mike's theory doesn't make sense. So, in 888, before the arrival of the Normans, you have the death of King Carul. Okay, so it looks like it's written Sirbal, and I think in John's lecture he said Sirbal, but I've heard it in Ireland pronounced Carul, King Carul. He was the most famous king of Ossory, and from him descend all the Maculopatricks, as well as anyone with the last name Brannan, if there are Brannan of Ossory, okay, as well as also the Costigans and the MacShiras. They all come from this man. He was probably the most successful, most powerful king of Ossory ever, and he died in the year 888, again, before the Normans. In the year 912, his grandson, Donald Mac Brannan, was murdered or assassinated by another member of the family who wanted to eliminate him and his descendants from the throne, to not have them gain any power. So he thought he'd be better off killing his cousin, and it actually caused an interesting war between the Maculopatricks even as early as 912. But the O'Brennans descend from that assassinated guy, and that's why they have the name O'Brennan, because they are the descendants of Brennan. In the Irish system, in the Brannan system, if you wanted to inherit land, which you needed to live, you had to have the name of the ancestor who was going to have that land. So since Cairble was the ruler of Ossory, they were staking a claim by calling themselves O'Brennan. They were the descendants of Brennan, Cairbal's or Carul's grandson. So that name O'Brennan is highly meaningful in a legal sense if you want to own land. That's why the family took it. Same thing with Maculopatrick. Those people didn't just take Maculopatrick because that was their dad. It was. But by asserting themselves that they are the sons of Gilpatrick, they are the Maculopatrick, they're staking a claim to the throne of Ossory by simply having that name. A little bit later, in 996, is the death of Gilpatrick. That's when he died. So that's where all the Maculopatricks come from. Okay, at least the Maculopatricks of Ossory. 1169 is the first arrival of Normans into Ireland. They came in several waves, but Ossory is attacked, and it keeps on getting attacked until eventually they submit. In 1192, that's around the time, give or take, maybe a year or two, when the Maculopatricks realize they don't have the resources to hold on to the fertile central plain around the Nore Valley, where it's very, very rich, great for cattle, great for horses. It's that rich land that makes them rich. They don't have enough ability to hold on to it, so they go up to the northern part of their territory, and they're going to clear it out. And while it's not well documented, it's documented enough. I mean, because of the violence of their move from Central Ossory to North Ossory, or Upper Ossory, a lot of things happened. Okay, occasionally happens in Irish history where a clan is displaced when they have to move from one location to another, especially if it's a major clan. I think the most famous example is the O'Sullivans. Has anyone ever heard of the song O'Sullivan's March? Listen to the Chieftains. It's a very nice marching song. But there was actually a time when the O'Sullivans out in Cork or Kerry were displaced, and they had to violently hack their way through a bunch of other clans to go find new land. Okay? But the thing with new land is there is no new land. Land is already occupied by somebody. So if you're going to make a move, if you're going to say to yourself, all right, guys, are we together? Are we doing this? We're going to go plow through a bunch of people and sink our teeth into some land, and we're going to own that land. It takes a great deal of violence, takes coordination, and so that O'Sullivan's March is actually well documented. And it's the west coast of Ireland. Like this, the O'Sullivans they very much know their history. They had to hurt other Irish people to blaze a trail through other people's territories to get to new territory where they reestablish themselves. It's a very violent act. You literally have to shove everyone out of the way and suppress other peoples. And that kind of stuff draws the attention of analysts and people who write history. People notice that, hey, a big Irish clan is on the move, especially if it's a prominent clan, like the Fitzpatricks or the O'Sullivans, a bigger name that has more of a history behind it. When big names move around, the monks and scribes and analysts write things down. And that's what you'll see in the annals. People pay attention to the big names. Lesser names don't get as much attention. Okay, so in 1192, that's the move to Upper Ossory. A little bit later, 1269, the Fitzpatricks have now established themselves in Upper Ossory. You can see here I've put sort of an ongoing land war. William Carrigan, who writes the definitive history of Ossory in his famous book, 4-volume set or 5-volume set, The History and Antiquities of the Diocese of Upper Ossory, of Ossory, he calls it a land war, right? But during that period, in the midst of it, you have a guy named Shepard, which is the Irish Geoffrey. All right, in the Irish alphabet, there is no J, there is no Y. So Shepard is his name, but it's actually Geoffrey. And that name is interesting. Okay, Carrigan notes and Sherman notes that that's not a native Irish name. Geoffrey is not an Irish name. That's a Norman name. That's a name that comes from the Normans. And he had 3 sons. He had another Shepard. He had a William, or Liam, and he had an Costigan. Okay? So there's a clan, a small clan, but a branch of the Fitzpatricks, because this original guy, Geoffrey, was a Fitzpatrick. His first son, Geoffrey, started the MacShira clan, because they were saying, oh, we're the sons of Geoffrey. His second son, Costigan, started the Costigan clan. Mac Costigan, over time, becomes Costigan. The C in Mac just kind of merges with the O in Costigan. Mac Costigan becomes Costigan. Okay? And Liam, his other son William, didn't start a family, or his descendants, if they call themselves MacLiam or MacLin, we don't have a known record of them. But we do know that Costigan and MacShira are names in Ireland that are connected with the Fitzpatricks. This is as far as the history goes. In 1346, Ahabo Abbey, some people have been there, it's a great place, in Upper Ossory, was accidentally burned by Dermot MacGillipatrick as he was attacking a Norman fortification right next door. You can go there, you can see it actually. It's funny because you're standing in Ahabo Abbey, and you look across where there used to be a wall. The building doesn't have a wall there anymore, but you can look across the field, and then you can see the Norman moat and bailey. It's a huge raised earth thing where there would have been a wooden structure on top of it. The wooden structure is gone now. There's a big tree growing in the middle of it, but it's a huge ring fort of earth. That was the fort they were attacking, and Ahabo Abbey, which is a very big church. I mean, it's where the bishop sat. It was burned down, and of course, they say it was burned down by Dermot MacGillipatrick because he was the one making the attack. He wasn't attacking the church. That was the church that their family had patronized for so long. He was attacking the Normans next door. And I should also mention something too. Kick it back real quick to 1192. When the MacGillipatricks first get up to Upper Ossory, and they have to be violent to assert themselves in the upper part of their territory, the violence that they did up there to possess that land was such that the Bishop of Ossory, who was at Ahabo at that time, a man named Felix O'Delaney, he couldn't endure the violence of the MacDillapatricks. It was not only disrupting church life, but all kinds of life. He couldn't exist in that area. It was too dangerous. So in 1192, he actually moves his whole office and stuff, everything around the bishop's seat. They moved down to Kilkenny City, to be with the Normans, who are now building a huge castle in what's Kilkenny City. The MacDillapatricks, by the way, had a palace in Kilkenny. There's been a geo-survey study of around St. Canice's Cathedral, and a guy named Colin O'Driscoll believes that he's found the location of the MacDillapatrick Palace. It's under the church. What appears to have happened, was that the Normans, as a symbolic gesture of their power in central Kilkenny, what they do is they knock down the MacDillapatrick Palace. They say, these guys aren't coming back here. They're out. And then he gives the land to the church. And the church builds a building on it. So now the MacDillapatricks can't get that land back, because now you have to attack the church. That was an old trick. That wasn't devised by the Normans. The Irish used to do that too to each other. You ever hear of Cashel? That was once owned by the Owenacht, the McCarthys. That was their royal site. And when the O'Briens eventually took over in Munster, they knocked their stuff down and gave the Rock of Cashel to the Irish church. And the Irish church says, okay, this is our land now, we can build stuff. And the McCarthys say, well, shucks, because they're not going to. So that happened in Kilkenny. So anyway, the violence of the MacDillapatricks coming into Ossory caused the Bishop of Ossory to leave. Right? So that shows that they're going up there and they're turning things over. And eventually, in 1346, the abbey itself gets burned down. And the last point here, in 1539, that's the year that Brian MacDillapatrick, on behalf of his nation, gives up his ancient titles. He doesn't do this lightly. He tenders his submission to King Henry VIII, and 2 years later, in 1541, he's elevated to the Baron of Upper Ossory. Okay, so these are the things I'm going to talk about. That's the only reason why there's not going to be a quiz at the end of this. It's a lot to take in. I get it, but I had to prep you with these things because Mike's theory makes no sense in light of these events. And Mike, I say that with all due respect. I also want to put this out there. I don't mind people having new ideas and fresh ideas. I'm all for that. But we have to take a look at history as well, not just genetics. So what he's putting forth is what I call the Storm and Norman theory. Okay, so this theory, I first became aware of it, I think as early as 2016 is when Mike started talking about it. He doesn't call it the Storm and Norman theory. That's catchy. I came up with that. So I'm going to trademark that. Mike, if you want to use it as a thing, you got to pay me money. Right? I came up with the presentation. But there is a gene in the Ossorian Fitzpatricks that the other, or not, I shouldn't say gene, but rather just a mutation, that the other groups of Fitzpatricks don't seem to have. It's called FGC5494. Okay? And this is a very rare gene, very rare in Ireland, and none of the other Fitzpatrick groups have it. Okay? You can think of this mutation not just as a mutation, but you can think of it as an ancestor or as a man. There would have been a time in history when one guy would have been the first guy to have this mutation. So the Y chromosome is what I have pictured here. It's the smallest human chromosome. Because it's so small, there's not a lot of room on it to mutate. When a father passes on his genes to his son, there's a 99.99% chance that the gene, the Y chromosome, is going to be passed on in the same exact way, right? Generally speaking. But sometimes there's a mutation, and no one ever knows if there's a mutation. It doesn't affect you at all, right? But if that mutation exists, then that son will pass it on to his sons, and so on and so forth. Okay? And as time goes on, these mutations accumulate, and so you can test the Y chromosome, and you can see how different people are more distantly or more closely related to one another. Okay, so there's a gene FGC5494. It's in the Ossorian-Fitzpatrick group, but it's not very common in the rest of the clans of Ireland at all. But it is somewhat common in some groups, some families in Scotland or in England or in continental Europe. Okay, so this was a big aha moment for Mike. He said, okay, so the Fitzpatricks of Ossory have a gene that's rare in Ireland, but it has more prevalence in continental populations or populations in Britain. And as more information came in, it was looking like this might not even be an Irish gene. So he began to think to himself, maybe the Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory are not Irish. Okay? So he posits that the late medieval MacDillapatrick, the Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory, he came up with this idea that perhaps the early kings of Ossory, before the Normans, they're Irish, but that at some point when the Normans got into Ireland, there was what's called an NPE. Does anyone know what an NPE is? A non-paternity event. That there was some sort of event, whether it was an illegitimate child, birthed by various means, or maybe perhaps someone just switched the names, right? Took the name Maculopatrick, but they weren't really Maculopatricks. So his theory states that the Maculopatricks were pushed out of Ossory entirely, and that what we call the Ossory group today, they're really Norman. That Normans came in and took on the identity of the Ossory people. They took on the name Maculopatrick, they took on the language, took on the culture. They were actually Normans. They secretly knew this, but they didn't tell anyone, and so they were acting as if they were the Maculopatricks. But really, the real Maculopatricks went elsewhere in Ireland. And where would they have gone? Okay, the Stormont Norman, they would have disappeared from that area. But where did they go? So to account for the loss of an entire clan, not just one guy, but an entire clan, Mike posits that the real Maculopatrick kings of Ossory marched all the way north to another kingdom in Ireland called Breffni. This kingdom in today's geographic area corresponds to counties Cavan and Leitrim. Okay, so that there's a big Fitzpatrick group up there. The Fitzpatricks of Cavan are a big group. So Mike is saying now that those Fitzpatricks of Cavan, he says, are the real descendants of the kings of Ossory. Okay? The other Ossory group, where there's lots of people on the ground today, if you go to County Laois, you test the Fitzpatrick of County Laois, he's going to match up with the Ossory group. He says, oh, you're not really Irish, you're Normans. The real Maculopatricks from before the Normans went up to County Cavan, and that's why there's a big population of Fitzpatricks up there. That's the theory, that's his thinking. And as evidence, he notes that the DNA connections to other surnames in the Ossory, for the Ossory Fitzpatricks, happen to have a Norman connotation or a Norman history to them. A name like Dalton, Brennan, or Brannan, which sounds very English, and Fitzgerald. These names are coming up in our study. There are Fitzgeralds connected to the Ossory Fitzpatricks. There are Brennans and Brannans, and variant spellings of that name, and Daltons, and we don't know what to make sense of it. How do you make sense of these? They appear to be Norman. And then also the use of these Norman names, Geoffrey, or William, these are Norman names. So somewhere in this land war, when the Normans and the Maculopatricks are clashing, at some point, Norman genes got let loose in Upper Ossory. The real Ossorians went up to Breffni, and the Norman genes continued to be in Upper Ossory. That's the theory. Also, the dating at FG, there's another, so if you know about DNA, it's a little tough to explain, but think of it like a file hierarchy. Okay, so if a remote ancestor has a mutation, he's going to pass that down to his descendants. But as those descendants split up, they'll have their own unique mutations. They'll pass on. So what you're doing is you're going through file hierarchies. If you're like, your Windows computer, you have folders and then subfolders, right? So think of the genes like that. And each folder is actually a guy, because this is a Y chromosome study, so it's always going to be a man. But we just name them these funny names. It's a little complicated. So under FGC 5494, down the ways, is another gene, FGC 5511, okay, or 5511. That is, as far as I know right now, that's dated to around the year 500. Okay, so if FGC 5494 was of continental origin, and Mike understands, he thinks FGC 5494 came from around the area of what's now the Netherlands or Belgium or northern France, and then a descendant gene from that, FGC 5511, is dated to the year 500. Well, in the year 500 in northern France, that would have been where the Franks were. Okay? The Franks were different peoples, of course, modern day, where the French come from. So he's saying that that's why he thinks that the Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory are Franks or Normans, because that Frankish blood would have been brought to England and then would have been brought to Ireland. So he'll constantly, on the DNA page and on his own society's page, he'll speak of the Upper Ossory Fitzpatricks as Franks or as Normans. And again, he's very, very assertive. He doesn't give, in the type of language that he uses, he doesn't give himself much wiggle room. He doesn't even put his own name on it. He doesn't say, I think this, or I theorize this, or this, I think this might be true. He says, scientists now think, or it's untenable to think that the Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory are Irish. As if there's a consensus of scientists doing this. But I'll tell you, this is armchair science. We're all armchair scientists. We're all donating our DNA samples. We're all trying to figure this out collectively. One of the best scientists in the game on this subject is Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick. She's a forensic geneticist. She actually solves cold cases that have been cold for a long time. So she classifies as a real scientist about this. Mike he works in chemistry. He does have a scientific background, but it's not true that it's a total consensus yet. There's plenty of room for debate. So I'm just going to show you real quick. This is oversimplified, but FGC 5494. Supposedly, at the way it's dated right now, there's always, you can think of the dates as never set in stone. The dates are subject to change as more information comes through, okay? But FGC 5494 is dated anywhere from 2,500 years ago, BC rather, to 2000 BC. That would be 4,000 years ago, right? So this FGC 54 guy, when he lived, that's 2,000 years before Christ. That's a long time ago, okay? That's way before the Franks. Cut down now to this next mutation, FGC 5511. The latest I've seen of when this was dated is about 500 AD. There's a massive time difference here, okay? But because this gene comes from that's why Mike thinks that this is a Frankish gene. Because anyone who bears this, if they've been living in Northwest Europe at that time, would have been living in the area the Franks rolled through. And then a sub-file of this, sub-file, aka another guy, A1487, this is a gene that is possessed by the Ossorian Fitzpatricks, the upper Ossorian Fitzpatricks, and it's dated to about 750 to 1050 AD. And there's a genetic bottleneck that goes on there. We'll talk about that. So oversimplified. But note too here, massive time difference, huge time difference. Between 500 AD and 750 or 1050 AD, not nearly as much as 2500 BC. Okay, so is FGC 5494 Irish? Is it not? Well, around 4,000 years ago, there was a group of people floating between the British Isles, Ireland, Great Britain, and northern continental Europe called the Bell Beaker people. Okay, they were called that because of their pottery. You see that guy? He's supposed to be a Bell Beaker person. This is an artist's modern reconstruction of it. So he's holding a vase or a jar that we know, this is how we know that their population was settling in a certain area, because they leave these pots. They all made their pots a certain way, so they're called the Bell Beaker people. But they were all over that area of Northwest Europe. And it appears that this FGC 54 gene would have been a Beaker gene. Okay? It originally thought to be of continental origin, according to some things that people have written. But other people have said, oh, maybe it's not even native to continental Europe, maybe it's native to Cornwall or Devon. Okay? These genes were spread all over the place, and they quickly fragmented and went different places. But when you're talking that age, 4,000 years ago, people getting up into Ireland, at what point do you consider them Irish? I mean, 4,000 years ago is a long enough time to be considered native Irish. If culture is spreading around after the Ice Age, around that part of Europe, they're spreading in there. Their genes could be going all over the place. They could be the FGC 5494 gene could be spread to Ireland and to England and to continental Europe. And depending on how their descendants fare in each of those places will dictate how much those genes spread there. Okay? But it can be considered Irish because it's so long ago. There's a guy named Joe Flood who tried to chart all the different sister haplotypes, or I don't know if I call them sister, but related haplotypes. And you can see that FGC 5494 is very rare in Ireland. So here it is, this lower blue arrow. It's supposed to be green. I know it's going to be real hard for you to see because it's such a tiny sliver. But out of all of the Y chromosomes that are related to it, FGC 5494 occupies a very, very tiny sliver of the Irish male population. It is very rare in Ireland. It's not the rarest. There are rarer ones, but there's not a lot more than that. You can see that in England, it's a bit much bigger. There's much more descendants from that guy living in England, and there's much more descendants, a similar amount living in Scotland, but also more on the continent. So it seems to have more of a continental or British origin, either one. What's going on with my phone? The phone's blowing up. No, okay, all right. There was a guy, Eric Shepard, who wrote a book called The King's Son. And this book first lays out FGC 5494, and it was being laid out to Mike, and this is where the idea of a continental origin first comes up. He was using conclusions and data based on a discussion group online, where there's an online discussion group about this very gene, FGC 5494, by a guy named Mark Jost. They were discussing it online, and at the time, around 2015, 2014, they were thinking, okay, continental origin. But things have changed since then. Okay, new understandings have come out, different people have written about it, but this was very influential in Mike's thinking. And I remember, I think it was 2016, he sent me this file, and this is before he broke away and started his own group. He started saying, hey, you might be Norman. And I said, oh, I'm not opposed to that thinking, but like, what's the evidence for it, right? And so I had my mind open to it, but the more he began to explain things, I said, this doesn't make any sense. There's another guy named Joe Flood. He's a highly respected statistician and urban economist down in Australia, who writes mainly on urban housing and development, but he also has a keen mind for stats, and he has also paid attention to this gene, and he's published a couple of good things on academia.edu. He took a website called The Big Tree by Alex Williamson, which is a website you can go to, where men can actually input their Y chromosome data, and they can see how they're all related. Some people from the Fitzpatrick study have been doing this. And we can see then the surnames that you wouldn't necessarily see. Like if you're with FTDNA, you can't see someone else's results of the test from another company, or you can't see outside of your own project. But by putting this all publicly on the internet, they can share information. So The Big Tree by Alex Williamson is a very important site, and it shows this smattering of different names that are associated with that FGC54 gene. And they're really interesting. It's not all Irish. There are a bunch of Irish names there too, but there's also some from all over the place. And at the time, Joe Flood didn't include our name, but he said that the middle-sized subclade branched very early, at least 14 ways, and it's found across Britain and Ireland, with small lines in Germany, France, and Spain, or Iberia. In the Isles, it's continued down in very long, thin lines to a number of discrete surnames in the present: Kenyon, Collins, McLaren, Maynard, Lunny, Maxwell, Phillips, etc. Fitzpatrick would be one of those names. And there seems to be no other relationship between these names, except for this gene. And there are 3 early lines in Cornwall and Devon. So Flood doesn't think that it came from the continent. He thinks it came from southwest Britain. Okay. But either way, coming from a very early period. And again, showing that it very well could have gotten into Ireland at a very early period and continued down today. And the Fitzpatricks of Ossorian happen to be one of those people. It doesn't necessarily have to have arrived from the Normans. There we go. Okay, so what to do then with this idea that a whole clan would disappear? I mean, the Maculopatrick clan, before at the arrival of the Normans, they were a sizable population group. They controlled a very valuable chunk of land in southern Ireland. Well, if the supposed descendants of Upper Ossory are Normans today, okay, then what happened to the real Maculopatricks? Did they just all die? Or is it plausible to think that they were all NPE'd out of existence, like the Normans made so many illegitimate children from amongst them that they bred out the Maculopatricks? I don't think that that's very plausible. Okay, so you have to wonder that, well, where did they go? And according to Mike's theory, they went up to Breffni. So what about these? And we're going to talk about Breffni in a second. But what about these other related Norman names? Okay. Has anyone ever heard the phrase that the Normans became more Irish than the Irish themselves? We've all heard this, right? Yeah. At a certain point, the Normans got into Ireland and they hibernicized. They stopped speaking French. They started speaking Irish. They took off the armor and started wearing more of the long-sleeved native Irish dress. They began to intermarry with the Irish, and they adopted the culture by and by, and they became even more Irish than the Irish themselves. This is seen by some people in the group as, this is evidence that the Normans adopted an Irish persona. They took on the Irish name, the Maculopatrick name. Right. Okay, but is that really plausible? And is that what that phrase means? The Irish, the Normans became more Irish than the Irish themselves. Is that were they really adopting other clans' names? What about the other Norman first names? What can we make sense of that? Well, So first off, the Normans never adopted an existing Irish name. That never happened. Anytime the Normans wanted to hibernicize, they took their own name and they just turned it into an Irish name, right? So the Fitzgeralds became MacGerald, right? The son of the Normans. They always took a Mac, but they never took an O. But at no point the Burkes did this. Different branches of Norman families did this to varying degrees. The Butlers of Ormond, they didn't do it that much actually. It's not across the board just to say the Normans did this as a group. Different Norman families had different ways of doing it. So the Butlers actually stayed very English. They stayed, for the most part, they retained more of their unique identity. But you have to remember, when the Normans are coming into Ireland, they're speaking a different language. They actually have a slightly different religion. Okay, there were Gregorian reforms that were going on in the continent. The papacy was shoring up its power, and they were changing traditional ways of doing things. When the Normans got to England, one of the very first things they did was they pushed out the native bishops, and they put Norman bishops. When they got to Ireland, they did the same exact thing. So there was a slight religious difference going on between the Normans and wherever they went. There was a language difference. There was a cultural dress difference. They dressed differently. The Normans would not have ever wanted to give up their own heritage and then assume a false Gaelic identity. They would never have wanted that. They wouldn't have any incentive to do that. But that's what Mike's theory states, right? And furthermore, the analysts, the Irish analysts who keep track of the history, the scribes, they never would have allowed that, okay? If you have an illustrious Irish name like MacGillipatrick, and suddenly Normans assume this name, the Irish scribes would have made hay of that, okay? The Irish were very proud of being Gaels, and they saw the Normans as foreigners. And no historian in Ireland during that time would have ever allowed or been accepting of a Norman who was taking an Irish identity. All right, so in our study, we got a bunch of Fitzgeralds. By the way, am I losing you guys? I hope I'm not. I hope you guys are still with me here. Okay, all right, good. Give me an amen, church.
Amen.
Thank you. All right, thanks. Because otherwise, I don't want to put you guys to sleep. We have a number of Fitzgeralds in our study, okay? A bunch of guys they have the name Fitzgerald. They've spent their whole lives thinking they're Fitzgerald. They take the DNA test, and they find out they're Fitzpatricks. Ooh. Okay, what to make of this? So on first glance, the Fitzgerald, it's quintessentially Norman, the Norman name. And Maurice Fitzgerald played a big role in the Norman invasion. Put this thing here, it keeps on vibrating in my pocket and distracts me. So Maurice Fitzgerald played a big role in the Norman invasion, and furthermore, throughout Irish history, the Fitzpatricks and the Fitzgeralds were oftentimes allies against the Ormond Butlers of Kilkenny. So there was a closeness there. And also, the names get confused. If your name is Fitzpatrick and someone's called you Fitzgerald before, put your hand up. Yeah, it happened last night. Right? Yeah, and it happens to Fitzgeralds all the time too. Fitzgeralds are like, yeah, I always get Fitzpatrick, right? Other people can't keep the name straight. So maybe perhaps we're all Fitzgeralds, and maybe perhaps there was an alliance there, and really our we're really Fitzgeralds, right? Or maybe people mix up the name, they can't keep the name straight. So maybe that's the theory. But if you look closely, upon closer inspection, the next slide goes, deeper analysis reveals that the Fitzgeralds that match our study, that they're part of our surname group, the Upper Ossorian Fitzpatrick, they don't match the rest of the Fitzgeralds. Okay? If you go onto FTDNA and you join the Fitzgerald study, you're going to look at a whole slew of different surnames and different haplogroups. In fact, the Fitzgerald study is way more diverse genetically than our whole Fitzpatrick study. We have more people in the Fitzpatrick study. We got over 460 people. The Fitzgeralds don't have as many people in their study, but they have a much broader range of haplogroups, of big differences, really early differences in their genes that show that these Fitzgeralds aren't even closely related to each other. Our Fitzpatricks, as different as we are much more closely related to each other than the Fitzgeralds and the Fitzgerald group. And furthermore, the people that believe that they have the closest genetic proximity to the landowning Fitzgeralds, they're in haplogroup E. Okay, we are R1b. Okay, so the Ossorian Fitzpatrick and almost all of the other Fitzpatricks in our study are R1b. So it's clear that the Fitzgeralds that match us aren't from the Norman group of Fitzgeralds, at least as far as we can tell, at least for the past 4,000 years. And also, because of their high genetic diversity, I mean, here's the haplogroups that are included in their study. If you log onto the page, you can see this. They're haplogroup I1, I1A1, I1A1, A2, J1, J2, R, R1A, and R1B. So there's no good reason to assume that just because we have some Fitzgeralds that connect to the upper Ossorian Fitzpatricks, that suddenly we're all Normans, or we're all Fitzgeralds. That group is so diverse, they have to figure themselves out. They have to figure out if they're Norman, I think, between all of those haplogroups. And it could be that the Normans had a variety of haplogroups coming in, both from Normandy, right? Between the admixing of people coming from Scandinavia and continental Europe. But that's not good enough reason to think that just because a few of them match us, that therefore the whole upper Ossorian group is now Norman. Also, we have a guy in our group, his name is Maurice Fitzgerald, Maurice Joseph Fitzgerald, called Joe Fitzgerald. He's been looking for an ancestor. He might be on the trail to somebody who's changed his name, an ancestor that switched the name for inheritance purposes from Fitzpatrick to Fitzgerald. So he's still searching, but he might be onto something. And nothing's settled yet. It's still up in the air. But sometimes that would happen. Sometimes you would just, if you wanted to inherit land, you might take your maternal uncle's name, and you can get his land if you agree to the name change or whatever. There might be reasons to change the name for inheritance purposes. So maybe that was the case. So again, that has to be considered. We can't just take anyone's surname and say, oh, automatically you're a Fitzgerald because you're related to these guys. There are reasons to change names. Okay, what about the Costigans? Several Costigans match the Ossorian Fitzpatricks. And that seems to confirm what history has been saying. That's what we think would have happened. We talked about Shepard. The analysts refer to him as the king of Sleeve Bloom. Those mountains in Upper Ossory that straddle the County Laois-O'Falley border, those are the Sleeve Bloom Mountains. So he was called the king of Sleeve Bloom, and it's his descendants, one of whom was Costigan, and from Costigan comes the Costigan surname. Well, we have a guy whose genes match. He's a Costigan, and he dates to around the time when that Geoffrey would have been alive. So he seems to be carrying on those genes. We have other Costigans too that match the Upper Ossory group, but right now the dating is slightly off. But it still supports the historical narrative, okay? But the thing with Mike's theory is about the first names that are around there. But we see in the results of the DNA study, we see an affirmation of the historical record. The DNA study is actually backing up what the history books say. So we have gene or mutation A1488. That's documented around 1250, and that would have been around the period that Shepard would have been alive. At a minimum, it dates to the first Baron, and it contains both the Costigans and the Fitzpatricks, so it confirms it. Okay, and sometimes you'll see, if you go online, you see Fitzpatrick as the shield given for Costigan, because they were Matt Patricks. But I've also seen this shield, and that's why I put it up there, the Costigan coat of arms. And I also have a map, which was on display yesterday at the museum, that had Irish surnames with the associated coats of arms, and that shield is listed for Costigan. So perhaps that's an old tribal symbol for some branch of the Upper Ossory Fitzpatricks that took the name Costigan. It's a very important surname, and if any Costigans are out there watching this, I would strongly encourage you to go do a DNA test with the Fitzpatrick study, the big Y test preferably, at FTDNA. We'll put that out there. Okay, we also have Daltons. Now, Dalton is sometimes spelled with a D apostrophe, capital A, L-T-O-N, but sometimes the apostrophe is lost, and it's just Dalton. Either way, Dalton means from Alton. It's a Norman name. Okay, so we got a bunch of Norman names popping up in our study again. Dalton. Well, he would have been a Norman knight. There was a Norman knight that arrived in Kilkenny in the wake of the Norman invasion. After the first initial invasion, a Norman knight by the name of Dalton arrives in Kilkenny. So, maybe he's the origin for the Upper Ossory DNA. But when you look at the Dalton study, it's also diverse. And the Daltons that match up with the Upper Ossory Fitzpatricks don't match the majority of Daltons who claim Norman heritage. So they don't appear to be Norman themselves. Okay? So this is more suggestive of a Fitzpatrick NPE, not necessarily a Norman NPE. And if you look at the Upper Ossory records, there's a lot of Daltons. I even saw in, I think it was the Land Corps' presentation yesterday, Mike and Kate. You guys had a slide which I took a picture of, where you guys were looking at some townlands, and the name Fitzpatrick was listed along right next to a Dalton. I think they were, I forget if they were renters or tenants, but I'll have to show you the picture I took to see the record. But you see Fitzpatricks and Dalton side by side, and perhaps, like Costigan, maybe there's a branch of Fitzpatrick that took the name Dalton, or another Irish word that may have been anglicized to Dalton, right? Or maybe a name change for hereditary purposes, we don't know. But these don't appear to be real Normans, but they are matching up with their studies. So the connection is uncertain right now.
Actually, somebody came up to us to say that in between that shot we had, where there was a Lawrence Fitzpatrick and a William Fitzpatrick, in between them was a Costigan.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I didn't understand what that meant at that time, but now I get why she brought that up.
Yeah, and you know, the thing is that the Costigans, when they first assumed that name, the local peoples would have understood them to be Maculopatricks. So perhaps in the name, in the way people would speak about things, you might say, oh, Costigan and the name might be interchangeable, right? You might know them as just a Costigan Fitzpatrick, or, you know, so you could, perhaps the name is a bit fluid, you know? We don't know, because Irish is like that. The Irish names go back and forth. There are examples of clans changing their name. Like, for example, I talked about the O'Keelys. I mentioned them because when Ossory was broken up into 3 pieces, 2 Maculopatrick clans were fighting over it, and the O'Keelys were also trying to grab their chunk. Well, that whole name, O'Keely, their whole clan changed the name to Whalen. The whole Whalen. The whole clan, right? Yeah, if you read Carrigan's history. So a lot of the Whalens around that area, they're really O'Keelys. But you wouldn't know that by looking at the name, right? The whole clan up and changed the name. Same thing with Fitzpatrick. Maculopatricks, we're really Maculopatricks. But we changed the whole clan. The chief took a name change, the whole clan followed suit. So these names aren't, in the early period, they're not set in stone, right? So if you find a Dalton, they might just have taken the name. Or they could have taken, again, like another word in Irish that maybe has been forgotten. But it gets anglicized as Dalton, right? So more research needs to be done on this. But that's good input, Mike. And now, another non-Norman name, Brannan. This is very important, okay? So there are many Brennans or variant spellings of that name that appear in this Fitzpatrick study. McLysaght, famous authority on Irish surnames, although he has some critics, but he states that there's 5 unrelated groups of Brennans or O'Brennans or Mac Brennans in Ireland. That there are 5 different clans, okay? And again, this is not common, right? My mother's maiden name, my mother's surname is McMahon. There's 2 unrelated McMahons. There's a group in Clare that are related to the O'Briens, totally unrelated group up in Monaghan and County Down. And they have 2 totally different names. They have the same name, okay? So, same thing with Brennan. But the Brennans of Ossory, as we mentioned before in the timeline, they descend from that guy that was assassinated, that guy who was murdered, Donald O'Brien, okay? King Carol's grandson. And he was killed around 902. So we can expect that if there was any genetic difference between the O'Briens and those that became Maculopatricks, that it would date from around the early to mid 900s. And guess what the DNA study tells us right now? Yeah, that there is a split. We can see the Maculopatricks on one side and the O'Briens on the other side. And the split is dated to around 950 AD. So the DNA evidence is actually supporting that. But there are these other names too, Branham, Brannan, Branham, which appear to be English. And they might even have a Yorkshire origin. Yorkshire, England. So here's what the annals say. This is going to sound complicated, just hang with me. This is from the Fragmentary Annals, that's what FA entry 443, that's just the annal date, or not the date, the entry number. But it's around the year 912. In this year, Donald, son of Brannan, son of Carol, was killed miserably in the middle of his own stronghold. And though Dermot had thought that he would be the better off for the killing the son of his kinsman, it did not turn out thus for him. For all of Clan Dungally, and Dungally, that's Carabal's dad, so all the descendants of Carabal's dad, rose against Dermot on account of that. And as Kellogg, ancestor of the Maculopatricks, as Kellogg would not rise against him, Mael Mordai, son of his kinsman of his, rose up against him, remembering the cruelty that Dermot had shown towards his father when he was an old man. And that Mael Mordai rose up fiercely and bravely against Dermot, and Ossory was divided in 2 by that war. There was great slaughter between them. Now the son of Aed, son of Dubgilla, the son indeed of the daughter of Carol, son of Dulan, went against Dermot, for he felt bitter that the son of his mother's brother and his foster son had been slain by Dermot. Many freemen were killed in this war, and many churches were laid waste. So the assassination of that guy precipitates civil war amongst the ruling family of Ossory, and much bloodshed happens. So we can say that the O'Brennans start off in a bad way with the people who eventually take the name Maculopatrick. And Kellogg, who's the ancestor of the Maculopatricks, he wouldn't stand up for the, he didn't try to avenge the assassination of his cousin. It's a little complex there, but that's a lot of information coming from the year 912 that gives us great insights as to this, okay? But it does show that the Maculopatricks and the Ossorian Fitzpatricks, they should be related, according to history. Here's a heat map that some fantastic people, I think at the University College Court, put together. I'm not quite sure who put this map together, but on the Brannan surname. The first map is census data from the 1659 census. So that's early enough, that's pretty old. And you can see different sections where Brannan, the name was more common, okay? And you can see in the Ossorian region, and especially in the upper Ossorian region, and also here in eastern Kilkenny, that the name Brannan is numerous. And there's apparently, according to McLysaght, 5 different groups of unrelated Brannans. So we can picture that this group is it's so distant, probably unrelated to these guys. This group, probably unrelated. This group, unrelated to the others. That group, unrelated up in Monahan. So you have these different population groups, but the O'Brennans are coming from right where the Maculopatricks, the Fitzpatricks, coming from. The second map is Griffith's valuation, much later, but by and large, those population groups haven't changed all that much in terms of their geography, where they are, okay? So we're expecting to find some Brannans going on that are related, okay? So we have variant spellings that we don't know what to do with. Brannan, Brannan, Branham, those appear English. They don't seem Irish, right? They appear English, and there's a group of guys who have these names, and they seem to have a Yorkshire, England origin. A lot of the people from that group, the guys that are discussing things online, they say, oh yeah, our ancestor came from Yorkshire, England. Okay, that would seem, oh, maybe they are of English stock. Maybe that's why there's a Norman connection to Fitzpatrick, because maybe a Norman knight from Yorkshire got up into Upper Ossory and somehow spread his seed. So we do have a DNA currently dated to a split around 350 to 1550. I think that's been updated. I think as early as when we were hanging out in the hotel lobby on Friday night, Mike Fitzpatrick sent me a message where there's been new activity on the DNA project feed as early as just this past Friday, and that's been updated. I think it is now. The split is showing a 950 origin point as the split between the Maculopatricks, or the Fitzpatricks and the Brennans, and that corresponds very well with the long annal entry I just read you about the assassination attempt. So the current dating places it with the land war of Ossorian. So I think these 2 points are actually out of date as of this past Friday. But again, it shows that the DNA evidence is actually backing up. There is a Brannan connection, and there is it is connected around the right time. But closer inspection of those Yorkshire Brennans, there's a number of them. They're all in America. None of them actually live in Ireland or England. So it appears that what looked like an English population group all came from one guy, a guy named Karen Brennan, who arrived in the USA very early, in 1680, thereabouts, at age 12. And they're not all unified, thinking that they come from Yorkshire. A lot of them think that they come from Fermanagh, right? So what is an Upper Ossory Brennan doing in Fermanagh? Not quite sure, but he very well might be an Irishman, not an Englishman, and his descendants appear numerous, not because they're coming from a population group established in England, but because there's the founder effect. He got there early in America, and his descendants spread out and took variant spellings of their name. And in 1680, you can't be Catholic in the American colonies. You're going to be Protestant. You're going to try to appear as English as you can if you want to survive. So if Karen Brennan, if he is in fact Irish, he would have been an Ossorian Brennan, and that explains why all of his descendants in the U.S. are matching up with Fitzpatrick's, because he would have been an Ossorian Brennan. But also that's very important, because when did the Brennans split from the Maculopatricks? Before the Normans, right? So if there is a Brennan-Fitzpatrick connection, and the DNA is saying there is, this split would have happened before the Normans got in there. So if we are Norman, we shouldn't have a connection to the Brennans, but we do, which shows that a Norman connection is impossible. If the real Fitzpatricks went up to Breffni, they should show some connection with Brennans, but they don't, right? So the fact that we have a Brennan connection shows that that's a pre-Norman thing, and that the Brennans are not questioned as to whether they're Norman or not. So that's another piece of evidence that is strongly in favor that we are not Norman. And there are other surname connections that we have yet to really shore up. There's Broderick. Broderick appears to sound like an English name. Believe it or not, that's actually a native Irish surname. And where does it come from? Ossory. We have a Broderick in the DNA study that connects to the Maculopatrix of Upper Ossory, the Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory. Appears to mesh. Dooley, David Dooley. The only reason why he came yesterday was because he connects to our study. There's a population group in Upper Ossory of Dooleys. McLysaght said they originated in Meath, not County Laois, but he has Upper Ossory Fitzpatrick DNA, so could be some, we do need some research on that, but it is from the Upper Ossory region. The guy I went to high school with, his name is Tom Keyes, and his dad just appeared in the study, and he's from my hometown. But we don't know where that name comes from. I don't know too much about it, so we need to figure that out. Robinson, well, the Earls of Upper Ossory, not the Barons, but the later Earls, they went to England, to the Bedfordshire area and the Ampthill area, around Ampthill Park in Bedfordshire, England, and they had massive land grants out there, and they married Robinsons. And I wouldn't be surprised if one day we find people in England who have Fitzpatrick DNA that are coming from around the Bedford area or the Ampthill Park area who match up with the Fitzpatricks because there were Fitzpatrick Earls living over there. You never know if some Fitzpatrick DNA got loose somewhere in England. It's being seen as English now, but it's actually really Upper Ossory. Same thing with Dyer and Butler. These are not, there are big numbers of these names in our studies. I think it's one of each, but we have to account for them in some way. Get that. There. All right, so now let's get to something also very interesting. This concerns now more the Cavan Fitzpatricks, the Breffni Fitzpatricks. So you see Ossorian down here. Okay, so Mike's theory states that everyone took a massive hike halfway across the island and settled in a different kingdom. And that Breffni must have welcomed them with open arms, say, hey, we have lots of free land for you guys. Please settle amongst us and take our resources. Sad to see that you lost your land to the Normans, but we'll accept it. Well, it probably didn't happen that way, right? No one's given out free land to Breffni. And why would the Maculopatricks have chosen Breffni as opposed to any other kingdom? I mean, there's no connection there. They didn't have relationships. They would have had relationships with the people more of Southern Ireland. So why would they have selected Breffni? But that, in Mike's theory, he's picking Breffni because of the high concentration of Fitzpatricks up there. Okay, but I feel that this is not fair to Cavan Fitzpatricks because it erases their history as well. It just turns them into Ossorians, right? But here's the thing: up in Breffni, those Fitzpatricks, they weren't called Maculafondre. They were called O'Mwale-Fondre. It's a different surname, O'Mwale-Fondre. Does anyone know from the Facebook or the email list? Do you guys know the name Matt Fitzpatrick? Do you guys remember? I'm sure you remember. He was very vocal. He's from the UK. Good guy. His name is Matt Fitzpatrick. He's very vocal about saying how his Fitzpatricks from Cavan aren't they're not Maculopatricks. They're O'Mwale-Patricks. And he's very patriotic for that surname. Well, according to Mike's theory, they've just been erased. They went from O'Mwale-Patrick overnight. Mike snaps his fingers and has an idea and says, actually, you're the real Ossorians. You're the real Maculopatricks. You're not really O'Mwale-Patricks. That erases their history. That's not very fair to them. It's not fair to the Ossorian Fitzpatricks, but it's certainly not fair to the Cavan Fitzpatricks to just erase their heritage. So, is it plausible to think that a bunch of Ossorians would have hiked across the island and settled in Breffni? Well, I don't think that's probable, because number one, the Irish annals say nothing of the sort. There's absolutely nothing in the annals that give any indication that the Maculopatricks ever did such a march. They do say they went from Central Ossory to Upper Ossory. We can chart that in the annals based on what's happening. We can see the violence that the Maculopatricks had to do just to do that, just to move within from what's now Kilkenny to County Laois. They had to be exceedingly violent to the people in the Upper Ossory area if they wanted to establish themselves. It's super implausible to think that they would have marched across Westmeath, or what's now Westmeath in Central Ireland, and gotten into Breffni. And if they had done so, they would have had to tear it up, and it would have been exhausting for them. That's a long distance. And the people up there would have resisted them like crazy, right? Also, if you know the land of Cavan, and this is no insult to people, any Cavan men out there, but it's full of those drumlins from the Ice Age, all those hills. It's not fertile, it's not luxurious. It's certainly, if you're gonna go pick a new chunk of land, you're not gonna go to Cavan to do it. You're going somewhere else. You're gonna try to find some fertile river valley or some other place. The reason why the Maculopatricks selected Upper Ossory is because they at least had some claim to it. It was some part of their former kingdom, and they knew the land. It's close to Ahabo and to Seir and other parts of their territory that they have a deep connection to. It makes no sense just to pick a random territory at Breffni and think that a bunch of people went up there. They would have had to hack their way to pieces. That would have drawn the attention of the analysts. If a major Irish family, a royal family, like the Maculopatricks of Ossory were, if they had hiked across the island and settled in Breffni, you would have seen it in the annals. It certainly would have been written down, and it's not. It's absolutely not. Okay? Also, come on, slide. The Breffni group don't have that FGC 5494 gene, okay? And they don't match other Ossory names the way the Upper Ossory Fitzpatricks do. Like names like Broderick and Costigan and Brannan. The Cavan Fitzpatricks don't match those names. If they were the real Ossorians, they should match those names. But they don't match those names. Okay? And the Cavan Fitzpatricks themselves don't have a memory of this. It's not like there's a tradition that they carry. Like, oh yeah, that time we got chased out of Ossory and we moved all the way to Breffni. There's no native oral memory of this, or no kind of native tradition that they as a people group have that indicate this. This is a theory. And I think this theory is coming from a guy, not even just Mike, but in some histories of Ireland, like if you read O'Hart, he talks about the Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory, but then he says, oh, there's also a group in Cavan, and he gives like one line to it, and he says, probably from Ossory. That's just a modern historian trying to explain how could there be Fitzpatricks up there. And he's not aware, O'Hart's not aware that they're really Owen Patrick, or maybe he is, but there's actually no connection. But it gets a little more interesting. When you say Mac Gilpatrick or Owen Patrick, you're not just saying a name, you're saying you're a descendant of a man. You're talking about an individual guy. Right? So Gilpatrick was a man. His descendants say, hey, we're Mac Gilpatrick. We're descendants of So Gilpatrick and Patrick, they were different individual men. It's not even close to reasonable to think that you can just take the name Mac Gilpatrick, cast it off, and take on the name Patrick, or that they're interchangeable. Right? That's saying it's like two different men are my grandpa. If you're Mac Gilpatrick, you're asserting a descendant from one guy. If you're saying you're Owen Patrick, you're asserting a descendancy from another guy. So it's not even just a name change. You're actually talking about specific individuals that lived, and that's what gives you claim to the land. Okay? While they both get anglicized as Fitzpatrick, they both get turned into, as the Irish culture is eroded and the English culture gets supplanted over it, they both become Fitzpatricks. But it's not reasonable to interchange them. And then further, there is a famous poem, okay? It's often called the topographical poem of Ireland. It's the Trillim Timhail na Fála by Seanmore O'Dugan, which is also John O'Dugan, and Gillaneve O'Huron. This guy, Sean O'Dugan, he died in 1372. He did an amazing thing. He wrote a poem where he begins with Irish kingdoms, and he takes every major family, and he says their name, he writes a short poem about them, and he connects them to a geographic area. And he does a whole circuit of Ireland doing this. And his poem is important because he lived after the Normans, but he's writing about Irish families, and he's connecting names to geographic locations, okay? And it's an extensive poem. He crafted it, but he didn't finish it. He died in 1372. He goes from Ulster to Connaught to Munster to Leinster, and he does Ossory. He wrote a little bit about the Ossory people. He wrote about Mac Gilpatrick, and then he died. His successor, his student who eventually picked up the poem and finished it, also wrote about the Ossory people and the Mac Gilpatricks. Nowhere in that poem is the name Owen Patrick mentioned. Nowhere when he talks about the people of Breffni, or what's now Cavan, does he mention Mac Gilpatricks. Nowhere does he even mention Owen Patricks. The name simply doesn't exist. He does very much mention the Maculopatricks of Ossory. He doesn't even say Upper Ossory, he says of Ossory. But the name O'Maelfratrick doesn't even exist there. So to guys who were writing in the 1300s and early 1400s, this name O'Maelfratrick was not connected with the Cavan region or the Breffni region, and the Maculopatricks were not there because they weren't there, right? So we can see in this poem that if the Maculopatricks would have moved up there, O'Harian would have written about them, or O'Dugan would have written about them, but he didn't because they weren't up there. And perhaps the name O'Maelfratrick is originated a little bit later than this poem. Okay, so maybe it originated, and they weren't that numerous, and they didn't hold that much land, and they may have grown into a larger clan in the 1600s after that poem was written. But we can see in that poem, there's no Maculopatricks up in Cavan or Breffni by the time this poem was written in 1420 or 1372, and there's no O'Maelfratricks there either. All right, so also, we're in the home stretch, guys. Not quite done yet. You still with me? Too much information. That's how I do it. The land war in Ossory, right? To say that the Fitzpatricks of Upper Ossory are Norman is like saying that, I don't know, Native Americans on the East Coast, well, you're all really just English. You know, the amount of fighting that the Maculopatricks of Upper Ossory had to do against the Normans to even keep what land they had left, and then to say that they're Norman. This is not supported by their behavior. Okay, they didn't act like Normans; they acted like Gaels. They spoke Irish. They dressed in the Irish style. They protected certain sites that had been in their hands for a millennia, and they were completely hostile to Norman incursions and culture. So the fact that they had to be very violent, and they continued to be violent towards the Normans for like 150 to 200 years, shows that they didn't think themselves to be Norman. They thought themselves to be Irish. The fact that Ahabo was burned in an attack on the Norman fort as late as 1346 shows that even at that time, they're not perceiving themselves as Normans, and they tried to do as much as they could to drive every Norman inhabitant out of their area. And in fact, when they submitted, when Brian submits in 1539 and becomes the Baron of Upper Ossory in 1541, Upper Ossory becomes a bastion of Gaelic culture and language. And there were medical schools run by Irish families, and the Ossorian grand judges were operating in their territory. It was a flourishing of Gaelic culture, and they did what they could, even by submitting. It just paid lip service to the Dublin administration and to the crown. Yeah, we'll submit. But by doing so, they stopped being a target for English attacks. This is very different from the O'More territory right next door. The O'Mores continued to fight on and were slammed continuously, again and again. And in their territory, they were the first place to get planted. The English crown put in planters in the territory of Laois, but Upper Ossory never got planted because they had submitted. So it remained very Gaelic. So that just shows just their behavior, the culture that was there. This is not a Norman outpost. This is a bastion of Gaelic culture. And again, I'll draw attention to that line, that border between Laois and Kilkenny. That borderline only exists because the Upper Ossory Maculopatricks are not Normans. Cooker. There we go. So this is the Maculopatrick Chapel in Grange Fertile, which we've been to. That's Sean Maculopatrick and his son, or his wife next to him. And then you also have Brian from Melcotes. In that interim period between 1192 when the Upper Ossory, where the Maculopatricks leave Kilkenny and they go to Upper Ossory, so between that date and 1539 when Brian renders his submission, the Maculopatricks were rather famous for fighting against the English. The annalists take note of their military actions against English colonization, and they write with, I don't want to say love or whatever, but the annalists note their Upper Ossory Maculopatricks are doing what they can to assault the English invaders. So in this early period, the Normans they're not going to just hibernicize very quickly. When the Normans come in, it's in their interest to retain their own culture and retain things that they think give them support and allegiance to the crown, and they're not going to just become Irish overnight. It takes some time for the Normans to hibernicize and to become more Irish than the Irish themselves. But in that interim time, they're fighting, they're at war with each other, and they're not intermarrying just yet, and they're not adopting each other's culture. Okay? There's interesting warfare. And the analysts, the monks and the scribes who are writing on these histories, they continually give the Maculopatricks their traditional title, the kings of Ossory. But we do have, in that period, we have these Norman first names, like Geoffrey and William. And those are definitely Norman names. But here we have Ossory Fitzpatricks giving their kids these names. Why? Why would they do that? Well, if you look at the whole slew of names from that period, you'll find out that the Norman names are an exception to the rule. Most of their names are native Gaelic names. Anamka, Carul, Donal, Dermot, Danahan, Finneen, Gilpatrick, Teague, Moyle Shepnil, Scanlan, Owen, Brian, etc. Most of the men coming out of that family have very Irish names. So that shows how they thought about themselves. They're giving themselves they're giving their own cultural names. They're giving the names of their own ancestors. They're not just giving themselves just Norman names all of a sudden. They didn't just become Norman. You'll see that the names like Geoffrey, William, they're probably not even coming from intermarriage. Maybe perhaps like, a Maculopatrick man married a Norman woman, and she gets to name the kids, so she names him Geoffrey, and she names, maybe that could be the case. But again, remember, there's religious reforms going on in continental Europe before this time, and Norman bishops had been supplanting for quite some time Irish bishops. Once the Normans got to Ireland, you had the whole loss of it was called the Celtic Christianity. That was more of what the Orthodox have today. The new way to do it is what's on the Gregorian reforms, and you have all these Norman bishops being put in places to implement these reforms. So if you look, first off, you can go to the website. There's a website called Index of Names in the Irish Annals, and you go to the page masculinely given names. This is where you can see all these Irish first names in different clans. Lots of Irish clans, not just the Maculopatricks, but lots of Irish clans had a small smattering of Norman names once the Normans get in. It does not imply Norman descent, but we'll also see that because the bishops of Ossory were also Normans, they're probably just naming their kids after the bishop, not necessarily descending from Normans, right? So during the period where Shepard Maculopatrick and his children would have been alive, we have two bishops of Ossory that were also named Geoffrey, right? So what are you going to do? Leave the church? No, you're going to stay in the church. The bishops of Ossory, it's a name now. So you can expect to have some slight impact on the culture through the church, right? Just because your name is Geoffrey doesn't mean that you're actually descended from a Norman. You could just be named after the bishop. That's very plausible. So with Geoffrey de Turville and Geoffrey Sentlinger, two bishops of Ossory during that time. All right, genetic bottleneck, what do? There's a narrowing of the genes around the Upper Ossory group, so it appears, this would be a Norman NPE. But you have to remember that there are very plausible reasons why there would be a genetic bottleneck by the Upper Ossory Fitzpatricks. They're a leading family, and a lot of violence happens to leading families. People want to kill them, their own members want to kill each other, politics being what they are, especially in a hotly contested area like Upper Ossory, you're going to find a narrowing of a gene pool. So remember, before the Normans come in, there happens to have been an event, the Battle of Makova, where a good chunk of the Ossorian royal family, which was on campaign, they were wiped out, lost the battle. Big upset. Murtagh O'Brien he got a coalition of people from Connaught, Munster, Ossory, and Leinster. They went up to the north to defeat some O'Neills, didn't make it. Right? That's also what led to the fragmenting of the Kingdom of Ossory. Different claimants of the Maculopatrick clan claimed parts of Ossory, and that's how it got divided up. And they weren't quite cordial with each other. And then, of course, when you go into Upper Ossory and you're doing all that fighting, that land war, you're going to take hits, right? So you can expect to see a narrowing of the Maculopatrick gene pool after the Normans, and even before. So the realities of Irish lordship, what you got to do to be an Irish lord for most of Irish history, you got to be violent. That's gonna be reflected in the narrowing of the gene pool. I don't see that genetic bottleneck as being strong evidence on its own for just a Norman origin. Okay, so has anyone ever seen these Fitzpatrick arms? We got them here on this flag. People have probably been wondering to themselves, I've never seen this before. This is actually the coat of arms that's granted to Brian in 1541. This is his arms. And you'll see there are variants without the stars, the sunbursts, right? His son, Barnaby, also Brian gets his name, Anglo-Saxon Barnaby, he goes off to France, and he's at the court of the French king for a year, and it's from the French king, Henry II. That's where the fleur-de-lis come in on the other flag, on this one, okay, that you guys are all probably more familiar with. But when Brian MacGillipatrick submits, there's a whole bunch of clauses that when he submits to the King of England, that the King of England wants him to do. So he wants him to change his name to whatever name the king gets. That's how we get the name Fitzpatrick. It also says you got to stop wearing Irish clothes and you got to start wearing English clothes. You have to stop speaking Irish and you have to start speaking English. You have to do a whole bunch of other things. You have to give it your firstborn son and send him off to England. That's how young Brian or young Barnaby gets shipped off to England in the first place. Okay? So he's willing to make these things, but it's showing the agreement from the kings of England are saying to us, these guys aren't Norman. We have to try to make them more English. We have to try to anglicize them. So that's evidence that these guys, they're not behaving like Normans. They don't have the cultural stuff that comes with Normans. Chances are they're not Norman. And also, the system of succession that the Irish traditionally used is tanistry. It's not primogeniture, right? So it's not automatic that when a lord passes on, that his firstborn son is going to automatically get the titles and the inheritance in the land. It goes by a gene pool, what's called a dervina or a dervine. It's a genetic pool of candidates who all descend from the king's great-grandfather. Any male in that gene pool is eligible for kingship. They're called redominant. They're king material. They would have been, you would pick the best guy, the king who's alive during his lifetime would select him and say, you're my Taoiseach, you're my successor. So if there was a Norman NPE, if there was a non-paternity event, if there was some illegitimate children that Normans had put into the Upper Ossory ruling family, if that's known, those kids are automatically not considered part of the dervina. They would never have been able to succeed the title. They would never have been able to succeed the name and the succession rights. They never would have been able to be the leading members of, so they're automatically exempted. The Irish system is very agnatic. It's probably the most agnatic, the native Irish system is the most agnatic system out there to keep land and power within a male lineage as much as possible. So just the fact that they use that, it's very hard, good luck Normans infiltrating that. That's hard to do. Okay, now someone brought up the Lion and the Dragon, okay? On Mike's website, where he speaks, the reason why I know what Mike is thinking, he publishes in his newsletters and he publishes on his website these things. He mentions the Fitzpatrick crest, and in it, he asserts that the dragon is, quote unquote, it's the universal symbol of a Celtic chieftain, and that the lion is a symbol of a Norman lord. And so he takes this crest and he gives it a symbolism or interpretation that, the Ossory Fitzpatricks, they're secretly Norman, and they know it, and they are taking over a Celtic chieftain. They're taking on that MacGillipatrick identity, but they're really Norman. This is crazy. It's a little crazy. There is no universal symbol for a Celtic chieftain. That's not a thing, right? And there is no universal, lions are not a symbol of just Normans. Lots of people use lions all over Europe. It's not a symbol of, so that interpretation is totally bogus. Also, as I mentioned earlier, this crest doesn't appear on the Fitzpatrick arms until later on. I think the earliest is Barnaby, the second Baron of Upper Ossory. But while it's unique in heraldry to the Fitzpatricks, it's all over church architecture in Ireland, England, and Europe as a misericord. You can find many examples of just decorative motifs in churches where they're carving wooden statues or wooden carvings on the pews. That's what a misericord is. There's lots of things that they carve, angels, plants, animals. But you often will see a lion in combat with a dragon. And that is supposed to be Christ overcoming the devil. That's probably how we got our crest. That's one explanation I think is very plausible. You don't see this symbol in heraldry at all, except for the Fitzpatricks. But you see it all over church carvings at misericords. So more than likely it has religious significance. If you also think about the Fitzpatrick mottos, Ceart, Ladir, or Laudir, Abu, or right, strong, to victory. Right has sort of almost a religious context. Where, yeah, we're right, we're in the right, we have the right beliefs. It makes us strong, that leads us to victory. Fortis sub forte fatiscet in Latin, the brave shall overcome the brave. Right? It probably has some religious significance. It's preposterous to think that it's just a symbol of Normans taking over an Irish clan. That's not plausible. Slides. Okay, and now we come to the end. The sword cuts both ways. If we're seeing a group of Fitzpatricks from Upper Ossory who have a long, well-established history, and the genetic record is actually confirming things, that we do have a relationship to the Costigans, we do have a relationship to the O'Brennans, and that you are seeing a genetic bottleneck as you would expect to see with a violent history, and then it backs up other things. We don't see a record to Breffni. We don't see a memory of Breffni Fitzpatrick, Captain Fitzpatrick coming from Ossorian. All the things I mentioned. What to do with these other outside surnames? Well, it's very probable that Fitzpatrick DNA got out and about in various ways. The sword cuts both ways. So he's saying that we're really Normans. I think it's the reverse. I think when you're seeing these other people who have different surnames, like Fitzpatrick, they're not Normans. They're Fitzpatricks. So different times. I mean, kick it back to King Caribald, who died in 888. He was a fantastic king of Ossory. He was also very potent against the Vikings. The Vikings were invading at that time. He rocked them, to put it in the American way. He allied with them, but when he had to, he slaughtered them with great success. That's what makes him one of the great kings of Ossory. That he had a very long rule. He had 40 years on the throne of Ossory. That's incredible that he ruled for that long, that he even lived that long, especially in the Viking era. He made alliances with the Vikings of Dublin and Waterford, and he also made alliances with the High King of Ireland. But you never know what is included in those alliances. Maybe perhaps some Ossorian DNA got out into the Viking world as part of some agreement. Here, take my daughter. We'll have a truce, and not a legitimate wife, and then the illegitimate sons go off into the Viking world in the 900s or 800s and go start other families that have different names, and maybe that DNA carries on. So perhaps, and also the Fitzpatricks being in Ossory, they allied and married with the kings of Waterford. So who knows, right? Ossory DNA could have gotten into the Viking world. Patrick is summoned by Edward II onto campaign in Scotland against Robert the Bruce, so someone may have gotten up into Scotland. Young Barnaby, when Brian submits to England, his son has to go live in England as part of the deal. And he spends his whole youth and adolescence and into early adulthood, and to mid-adulthood, living in England, and also for a time abroad in France. And I mean, Edward VI, his best friend, was very puritanical, but you never know what's going to go on in the court of the French king. And in fact, actually, Edward VI even warns him, look out for the French ladies. You never know if any of these Fitzpatrick males are siring the legitimate children along the way. Also, the barons, the Baron of Gowran, the Earls of Upper Ossory, and the Barons Castletown, they had large estates that were given to them in England and that they had inherited in England. So they were hanging out in England for most of their lives. That's mainly where they were based. I would not be surprised if you find people in the Bedfordshire area in England who come up with Fitzpatrick DNA. That's very plausible. They might have different surnames, but they're probably really Fitzpatricks because we had landed ascendancy who were very wealthy, throwing big dinner parties constantly, over in England. So if you're finding Fitzpatrick DNA in England, that's not necessarily indicative of a Norman origin. It's probably just Fitzpatrick DNA running amok. Right? And so here's my map. The Viking world would have been extensive. You have England. So, and of course, remember Karen Brennan coming to the New World, you'd have founder effects. So Ossorian DNA could be all over the place. We don't necessarily have to just impute a Norman DNA, a Norman origin to it. It could very, very well be that Ossorian DNA is exactly what the history books say it is, that the Upper Ossory Fitzpatricks are indeed Irish, and they have been there for a very long time. Okay, so conclusions. So the DNA testing right now, I believe they do corroborate the tradition, the native Irish tradition. I believe that what we're saying in our society is pro-Irish, and it supports the Fitzpatricks of Cavan and their own O'Muel-Patrick history, and it supports the Upper Ossory Fitzpatricks. I believe that the Storm and Norman hypothesis is wildly speculative. I believe it's focused mainly on the genetics and doesn't take into account history. I don't think it's very objective. The way Mike writes about it, he's very sure in his language, and he doesn't give himself any wiggle. He's really hung his hat on this. In his whole group and what they're putting out, if it turns out that he's not correct, this is going to be very not good for his group. But the historical evidence strongly runs contrary to this hypothesis. That needs to be wrestled with, and I don't think that there's a way that there can be any reconciliation between this new idea and history. And again, I'm not saying that he can't have an idea. Like, anyone can have an idea. You have theories. You need to have the freedom to express these theories, but you have to state them as if they're theories. Again, Mike is being very assertive in his language, and that guy, that email, John Fitzpatrick I was talking about, he's an old gentleman. He's messing with someone's identity at the end of his life. We have to remember we're all people. We're trying to understand ourselves. So let's not be too emphatic. let's come up with ideas, but we'll state them cautiously, and we'll give time for more data. So, how do we get more data? I would encourage, if you haven't done it, if you're watching this online or you haven't yet tried it, do an FTDNA study. I do think that FTDNA right now is the best place for us. Last year, we were wondering if maybe we should start a new study elsewhere. There's more people at FTDNA that you're going to find matches with. They have an excellent selection of tools to be able to analyze and understand your DNA and your relationship to people. Their Big Y study, while some people might have critics of it, it's still one of the best things going. We want people, I would strongly encourage anyone to do a Big Y study. Pay for the Big Y upgrade. It's going to provide a lot more data. And they also have other means as well. If you're into autosomal and mitochondrial DNA, they have the tools that are in there. You might not know how to use them, but there's lots of YouTube videos where you can watch and learn how to use these tools. And I can try to help you a little bit with what time we have left now. I don't even know how long I've been talking. But here are my sources. You can check these things out. I'm going to try to send this PowerPoint out so you guys can take a look at it or have it for yourselves. And that's all I got, guys. So thank you very much.
Very good.
Okay. Sorry, are you guys awake?
Don't step on your phone.
Oh, deal, yeah.
Summarize that in 45 words.
All right, everybody take a break. Oh, yes.